My name is Kotaro, handling he, him. Good luck.
Thank you. Before I invite the Prime Minister, I just want to notify the debaters that I might not be able to put the timestamps in the chat, so I highly recommend. Prime Minister, here.
Amazing. Can I confirm I'm audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Cool. Great. POIs verbally. I repeat POIs by voice. I'm not looking at the chat. I'll try and ask from CO at 5 minutes, but yeah, just verbally unmute. Okay. Sorry, give me a second. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I'll explain what this means and then give 3 arguments. 1, why fantasy is better than documentary style. Secondly, in how this harms the artist. And thirdly, on minorities. What does this narrative look like? It, 1, asks you to prioritize realistic over fake experiences. Because obviously, to be a lived experience means that you probably want to talk about what is realistic in the first place, i.e. documentary style kind of stuff, over thing that's more imaginatory and that sort of stuff. Secondly, it often means you prioritize your own experience as an artist over the others. The reason this is true is because of the CA clarification that says that this is about the experiences that you have lived through being important, which means it's not necessarily glorifying common man experiences, but your own experience as an artist. Notice what the counterfactual looks like. It probably means that you do not have the glorification of that authenticity, which means it may be valued to some extent, but it's not going to be glorified. It's just seen as one way to be an artist, but to also have escapist or impressionist or, like imaginative art is also seen as useful. Also, to talk about art that isn't generally about your own experiences, but that could also be about other general stuff is there. This is obviously likely because many people derive different values from art, and many types of artists exist who value one type of art over the other. And there is obviously usually a competitive incentive to try and like be different from the prior kind of art to some extent, right? Because that's the way you could get recognition yourself. That doesn't happen when this glorification, which overwhelms those other instincts, happen. What then are the arguments? Firstly, I think fantasy is better than documentary in nature. The reason for this is, first of all, because it's far more exclusive, right? On both sides, you still have things like news organizations and, other sorts of stuff that often portray things in a more documentary or objective fashion, that often talks about how, like, people's lived experiences are, and often can use emotive language within their specific articles and their own stories anyways, which means often the unique value of art is to counterbalance this to some extent. It is to be escapist to some extent in nature, to have a protagonist whose struggles you can see in them, right? That is uniquely imaginative, and that is something that fantasy can provide. And this is secondly important because it often is far more escapist on our side. And that's because quite often authenticity on op can often be framed in negative terms. Maybe not all the time, but often to be an authentic person, to have lived experience, often means to show that you've gone through suffering, to show that you've been willing to go through problematic or traumatic things, right? Because often it's seen as more authentic to have gone through like negative experiences, because negative experiences means that it shows the real nitty-gritty nature of how people ought to be living and that sort of stuff, right? What does this then mean? First of all, you feel a far greater sense of catharsis that's exclusive to art on our side of the house. People, when they read and watch art, people, when they go to the movies and their side, feel a greater sense of happiness. But that also means that there's far more funding available for art in the long term because it's seen as more popular on our side, because it isn't constantly trying to compete with news organizations in the first place. But secondly, in this real world, I think life experiences can often be quite negative, right? Like often we go and work incredibly long hours in jobs. Often we are beholden to corporate overlords who have incentives to pay us low salaries. Often historically you had actual kings who didn't give us democratic rights and often killed us in many instances. In that negative world, sometimes what is traumatic is to constantly focus on the authenticity of those lived experiences, right? On our side of the house, that gets to be uniquely different because you're able to instead find a place to escape, feel a sense of hope and happiness when you feel that you feel that when you're able to escape into that art that could be more positive on our side more often, right? And even if it's like slightly escape is negative, at the very least you feel that it's a different type of experience that is there, right? Because even if it could be dystopian, at least it isn't your real life dystopia right now, which means you often feel a little less triggered by it. This I think helps the most amount of people on our side, right? Thus it is important. Second argument on how this harms the artist, and I think given that authenticity often looks like an opposition, meaning that you feel the need to go through depression in order to seem more authentic, or need to go through suffering in order for that to be valuable. Two kinds of things can happen. First of all, there tends to be increasing amounts of trauma porn because there is a competitive incentive to have a race to the bottom. That is to say, you want to be be more traumatic in order to be more authentic. You want to either go through more suffering yourself or over dramatize how suffering is shown, which means you show more gore and more bad sort of things on your side of the house. But secondly, it also glorifies the starving artist narrative, which means you have a competitive incentive to go through bad experiences yourself, right? Because the more authentic your experience is, the better your art is going to be seen. And the implication of that is either you actively don't try and solve for the issues when you have them, things like depression when you go them, because you think it is important to your art in the first place, or you actively put yourself in somewhat more dangerous situations in the first place because you think it's important. This also reduces the incentive to try and fight for better rights for artists in the first place, right? And the reason for this is because when you think that it is part of an artist's experience to be authentic, to go through negative things, then you're less willing to fight for actual increasing of wages because you think, you know what, it's part of the grind and hustle culture. It gives you inspiration for your art. The impact of this is as follows. Artists get harmed a lot more. Their ability to fight for wages is a lot reduced when rich celebrities or rich artists are less willing to fight on behalf of poor artists because they think, you know what, the grind and hustle is part of what makes you an authentic artist in the first place. Notice the counterfactual, which is far better, which is that on our side, you often think that now you don't have to primarily refer to lived experiences, right? Which means that often you don't feel the need to always glorify what it means to be negative. But secondly, at the bare minimum, artists on our side get far greater autonomy to portray a variety of different experiences, right? Not just a lived experience. So they can make fantasy art, which means you feel a far greater sense of catharsis. This is obviously the way is that this is the most vulnerable group of people, right? Because artists is just a tough job, right? It often is a gig economy. You often don't get paid. We get far greater chance for that to actually improve on our side of the house. Before I talk about the third argument, how this helps minorities, closing opposition.
You are relying on an oversimplification of how art looks in opposition side. I mean, Woody Allen can talk about his personal sexual life without being like really tragic and can use fantasy elements. So I don't believe the comparative is that you are following.
No, but the point is it has to be an authentic lived experience, right? The more fantastical you make that lived experience, the less authentic it seems because the less real it is to the actual lived experience of a person on the ground, right? And if you try and just make up experiences, it will be called out as less authentic than other people's experiences because you obviously do not know the experience you're actively talking about, right? So on our side, we get far more utopian or dystopian art in the first place. Yours has to be realistic. Thirdly, on minorities, and there are two scenarios, right? Firstly, I think most artists are probably rich when they are doing art. That's because art is often very expensive, right? There is no guarantee that you get a certain amount of money from galleries. You often have to live in very high cost living cities. And there is no incentive for studios to try and pay a lot of money because they make a lot more money by, not paying artists to a significant extent. So often you have to do things like networking and gig economy, which means the people who make it are people who have existing connections and networks into the industry. So they tend to be richer. What does this mean? When you focus on prioritizing your own lived experience, that means the rich people's experience get portrayed a lot more for that specific artist because they themselves are richer, right? They portray the authenticity of their own lived experiences. On the counterfactual, even if it's only rich people on our side, at least the art that rich people provide is in some instances at least more relatable to a minority because it often might be far more escapist in nature. So it means that any minority could see themselves in an art that isn't about the real world and often can be generally human tendencies. But secondly, trauma porn obviously can harm minorities. Even if you have minority artists in opposition, they feel a greater sense of PTSD because their own real life experience is constantly talked about. On the counterfactual, at least that trauma porn doesn't exist. You don't feel horrific every time you try and read or see an art in the media. Hence, the most vulnerable people is also helped. Three arguments, very happy to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech. Now I invite the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Hello. Hi. Chat, please. Oh, shoot, I was muted. Sorry. Chat, please. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Let's go. I just want to make a very clear clarification right off the bat, which is that we're not really creating a dichotomy here between documentaries and fiction media. We would suggest that the motion specifically demands for you to create art in general through the lens of authenticity and lived experience, which precisely means that you are allowed to create fiction, you are allowed to create fantasy for as long as it is based on authentic lived experiences of racism, of depression, of whatever that you personally have experienced in your life. What we precisely support on opening opposition is a couple of things. The first thing we would posit is that the glorification of authenticity for lived experiences precisely benefits minorities who often are shunned from the art scene. The second thing we're going to suggest is that even if the glorification doesn't directly result in an overwhelming benefit for them in the art industry, the principle should be dictated that minorities should take reign of their lived experiences, and we precisely do not want it to be hijacked by the aristocratic white individuals of the art industry. The third thing we're going to suggest is that we want to advocate for a change in process. Who exactly has the say to create incentive for record labels and art houses to continue creating and speaking directly to artists from marginalized communities and get the art from them? What does opening opposition do? The first thing we're going to argue is that lived experiences are important because otherwise discussions on race, gender, and other terrible lived experiences would be hijacked by the elite. The second thing we're going to argue is that minorities will be easier to allow themselves to penetrate into the scene in a way that benefits them. But before I go on, I have two responses to Prime Minister. First, what is the debate? PM creates a dichotomy between documentaries and, for example, fictional stuff, but this isn't even true. The first reason why it isn't true is because a lot of your lived experiences can inform fiction. So empirically, this is true. For example, the creators of Black Panther, while Wakanda is entirely fictional, the experience outside of Wakanda was informed by their experiences as a Black individual in the US. Or for example, If I Had Your Face was informed by Frances Chaw's experience with beauty standards and marriage standards in South Korea. But even if we do the same thing as news, the first response is that it's packaged very differently, in a way that is artistic, in a way that shows a narrative, not in the very matter-of-fact, very outlined way that they do in news. So to some extent, we're not in direct competition because we're still delivering a need for people to consume information about the world or lived experiences about the world in a way that is not necessarily dragging or boring to them. The second thing they argue, which is quite ludicrous, is that you will inflict suffering on yourself because of art. The first thing we want to say is that there's a natural disincentive for you to inflict harm on yourself just for the purpose to be able to create genuine art, like the physical feeling you feel of trying to inflict pain on yourself, the fact that you probably don't have the means to inflict like racism and homophobia on yourself if you yourself are not belonging to racism or homophobia. But second of all, even if you are capable of inflicting harm on yourself, that lessens the degree to you are authentic. And this is something that people in the art scene can detect from you through, for example, when they interview you, when they ask about your lived experiences. If this is something you yourself cannot directly articulate in a way that someone that actually experienced those things, can articulate, then they can identify that, and that decreases your popularity overall. The third thing I want to make as a clarification is the way this exists isn't like you create art and then all of a sudden you choose to suffer for your art. It's oftentimes a lot of people that were born into circumstances of racist worlds, of homophobia, of the patriarchy, for using art as a way to benefit from their suffering that they had no choice but to confront, but also find sense in their suffering. We think the timeline on opening government is quite unclear. First thing, lived experiences. We would suggest that the vast majority of art that currently exists in the white world, for example, is skewed towards white individuals. The first reason is because the deciders of what gets to be put in an art house, what gets to be shown in a film festival, historically, have been white individuals. And as a result of that, without the glorification of lived experiences, authentic experience, there's no way to countercheck whether or not the lived experiences being represented in these films or, for example, in these festivals are reflected of people that actually come from those places. The second thing is that the lived experiences will be reliant on stereotypes and archetypes, for example, insofar as the discussion is between creators of this media that do not come from that lived experience, as opposed to people that have actually experienced not just the overall experience of, let's say, racism, suffering, depression, homophobia, but also people that have specific nuances to those experiences. The third thing is that it decreases incentives to research, largely because it has high cost and it has high investment. The best people themselves within communities, it would be best that we get people within those communities with those actual experience so they themselves can benefit from the fame, the fortune, and the gold. The impacts here are fourfold. The first is because of misrepresentation. The idea that we are more likely to propagate stereotypes, negative attitudes, discrimination, because we are so locked in allowing ourselves to the precise white people or very, elite people that they talk about in Prime Minister, precisely because there is no counterbalance to the existence of a lot of the capital that these people have. The second is that even when they are well-meaning, a lot of the assumptions that they operate under are patronizing. So for example, when we confront ourselves with victims survivors of sexual abuse, we're likely to always assume that they're suffering, always assume that they are weak, as opposed to the reality that people respond to the reality of sexual assault very differently. The third thing is also you don't change much, but the fourth thing is also people who consume may have difficulty relating or having stronger empathy with the media that they consume, because they are less likely to search up the life story, relate, for example, to how that person's lived experiences relate or connect with the media that they've experienced, which creates a much more compelling narrative around the art. Before I proceed, David, go.
So there's a missing link here, which is that you are successful in checking these artists, but like they can lie about their personal lives, especially when you glorify creating the incentive to lie.
So if you glorify it, you will increase the incentives to ensure that these individuals are authentic. The propensity to lie about lived experiences just to prove the nature of art could also exist on your side anyway. It's on our side wherein we want people to be authentic. So we ensure that we want to assess authenticity by putting people through interviews and other things like that. The second argument is it allows minorities to penetrate the art scene. The demand for minority art increases for 4 reasons. The first reason is because a lot of the art for our white individuals is quite oversaturated. So there's a capital incentive to create different kinds of art. The second is because the world becomes more progressive. The third is because we want to build more trust amongst different communities. The fourth reason is because entertainment serves as a form of escapism from oppression for a lot of these minorities. So they themselves want to consume not just entertainment, but also entertainment that represents them. So while there is demand for consumption, without the glorification, there wouldn't be a lot of incentive to create that art to begin with. We would suggest it's also hard to enter and people are less likely to self-select themselves for 3 reasons. The first is economic reasons. If you feel like you won't succeed in the art scene, you will not self-select yourself and enter into the industry. Second is subjectiveness. You feel like there's a lot of bias, gender-wise, race-wise against you, so you don't enter it. The third is that a lot of the way art has been done historically is done by aristocrats and people, from art houses and, art industries that don't necessarily understand how people on the ground have their own lived experiences. The glorification enables aspiring minority groups to self-select and enter the industry. And given that we define that there is a demand and that the lived experiences are better, we capitalize and allow those lived experiences to be given more light from the ends of the people that get to determine what gets put in a film festival and what gets put in a museum.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech. Now I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Oops, sorry.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So before my speech, I just want to say trigger warning. I'm going to be talking about experiences of racism, sexism, also about sexual harassment throughout the speech. So yeah, just wanted everyone to know. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the first thing I want to discuss is trauma and suffering. I want to note first that DPM explains the natural incentives to be able to discuss these kinds of experiences. But the problem with PM is not that they are discussed at all. But secondly, the fact that they are over dramatized, that they portray people as just victims of their own suffering a lot of the time. This is not a problem that happens on opposition. This is a problem that happens on government, when people who have never experienced such things have only heard ways in which things like harassment happen that are more likely to discuss trauma and suffering in very negative ways. There are 3 structural reasons for this. Firstly, if you've never experienced it yourself, oftentimes your sources of information are the fear-mongering news that focuses on the worst parts and dramatizes it, or people within your own circles, like men, trying to experience, or rather interpret the experiences of women and try to point out how it happened, why it happened, etc. The nature of it being over dramatized rather than a realistic depiction of suffering is more likely on Gov. Secondly, is a matter of agency. If you yourself have gone through something like harassment, it is not likely you see yourself as just a victim, but it is likely how third parties and people who have never experienced it might view you, that the experience of suffering is precisely what defines you. Whereas those who have lived experiences, yes, have gone through things like harassment, but at the same time, there are a series of other identities that they hold on to and cling on to, many other experiences that they have, which is precisely why the biggest push to not call them victims and instead survivors comes from people who have survived sexual harassment themselves. It is when you have seen your own myriad of experiences rather than only knowing someone for having experienced harassment, which is oftentimes the only thing that will be highlighted by people who have not gone through it themselves, that are more likely to reduce people as lacking agency. Thirdly, it is incredibly likely that triggering and incredibly dangerous ways of depicting and portraying things like harassment and suffering is more likely on their side of the house, precisely because these are things that are shocking, they get views, etc. Whereas on our side of the house, note, people who have gone through this have to watch this like film, for example, edited over and over again, listen to the lyrics of their songs over and over again. The likelihood of triggering yourself and at least being aware that it could possibly trigger other people is much more likely to come from people who have gone through it themselves when they know exactly what could possibly happen. So discussions of trauma and suffering, as DPM mentions, may be equal on both sides in terms of how likely they are, but the degree to which they are poorly discussed is more likely on OG. Secondly, they see that minorities are entering anyway. The first thing I want to note is that they can't use status quo mechanisms to prove this, when what we explain is that status quo mechanisms in a regrets motion err on the side of op, and it is uniquely the bargaining chip of being able to say, I've experienced this, I've gone through this, that it is much more likely that they are entering this space to begin with. But secondly is, look at their ways of proving this. Bea does not disagree with this. She has a very nuanced stance of, on the side of consumption, we are becoming more inclusive, but on the side of creation, we are not becoming more inclusive. And there are many reasons to cater to minority groups in status quo. There's a saturation, which we've already, like OG ignores, of white media, and it's so hard to create new stories. You need a differentiating factor and a capitalist incentive to do so. Secondly, there's a growing demographic. By 2050, minorities in America will outweigh the white majority at present, and you want to be able to build the base now. Thirdly is access. The media has become increasingly cheaper with streaming services, lowering prices, everyone having a smartphone. And so previously disadvantaged groups that were not important markets are important markets to cater to now. But without this glorification, these groups will consume media created by white individuals that cater to them. However, on the side of creation, there are so many structural reasons that OG does not show as to why they're able to overcome them. Firstly, in a very subjective space, it is more likely racial and gender biases come about. Secondly, is if you're from an economically disadvantaged background, doing art is an incredibly risky thing to be able to do. But thirdly, is that because it's always kept within institutions of art, it is often the elite that hold the ability to be able to determine who is good at art, what is good at art. And therefore, on our side of the house, this is a unique bargaining chip to be able to have studios take on more minority artists, but also train more minority artists as an film institution, as an academy, as a university, for example. And therefore, the overall inclusion is much more likely on our side of the house. And this is an important and much more certain benefit because it caters to the most vulnerable group. And if they say, well, you can't create other forms of art, what we'd say is we first need a seat at the table to be able to enter in order for them to be able to build a big enough base and expand so that if they want to venture into abstract art, they can. But at present, that's way too risky and they don't prove the likelihood of that. I'll take CG.
So the flaw in this case is presuming that minorities' lived experiences get prioritized when it's that same elite dictating that conversation, the same subjective space of authenticity that means the racism is still used in this narrative.
I have given many structural reasons why consumption on the side of minorities and them wanting to hear stories about them is likely to come about. Obviously, the elite and white majority is likely to exist on both sides. We say that we need to be able to differentiate ourselves. We're not saying it's going to be majority minority art, right? But there are many incentives to be able to create minority films. We're seeing this in status quo over and over and over again. Parasite won, Moonlight won. There's so many black films in status quo. We had a Black Panther. All right, next. They say escapism is good. One, not mutually exclusive. In fact, they give structural reasons. There's a significant amount of presence of escapism already, and therefore there's a way in which we can already introduce lived experiences, an important thing to be able to cover. But secondly, even assuming we have less fantasy, more realistic experiences, this is really important for minority groups for three reasons. Number one, suffering is a very isolating thing. You need to know that other people are out there, that people have the same experiences, that it's not just a you problem, but a systemic problem. Secondly, is you need to be able to make sense of the world. You often are incredibly confused and left in a state of confusion when you experience suffering and need to be able to make sense of it. Movies often help you process that. Music often helps you process that. I think all of these things show that you need to be able to make sense of the world through art. But lastly, is that when you don't have good depictions of suffering, then the solutions people come up with are also not going to be good. So when white audiences watch a white-made movie about black people, they will think, these are the problems black people face, and here's how we're going to help them and save them, when oftentimes this is not the narrative that a black person would have used to be able to show their own stories. Lastly, is that lived experiences do not need an incredibly good figure that will always encapsulate everyone's experiences. Number one, if the problem is lying, this is a very, very big figure that you're going to create, especially when it's a big form of art. The amount of scrutiny and fact-checking is going to be huge. But secondly is that we need a variety of different lived experiences. And that's precisely what you get from the glorification. Because at some point, you'll reach one movie, one album that speaks to you in particular. And therefore, we don't have the pressure of having to prove everyone is going to be good, but that there's a variety of lived experiences and you can connect to at least some. I'm very proud to oppose.
I think the deputy leader of opposition for their speech. Now I invite the member of government here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'll take my POIs in the chat between the 5th and 6th minute from opening. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. There's no engagement in opening. OO's arguments rely on making sure that lived experiences are authentic to protect minorities and empower them. But the problem is, on opposition, they make it way worse. 3 levels to this. Firstly, The glorification means that art galleries and magazines have to review way more pieces. So just in terms of logistics, it's much easier to lie and get in because the fact checking of these things is much worse. Secondly, you create incentives for artists to lie in the first place because it is glorified to be authentic. And if you don't have those lived experiences as a white artist, the best that you can do is just try to be authentic and try to represent those struggles because it's seen as a prerequisite to succeed. But even in the best case, this presumes that all lived experiences are valued equally when this motion is not just about authenticity. And this is the link that both opening teams miss, right? It's about the glorification of authenticity, which means that society is told to choose what is authentic, and this can be inaccurate or at the very least invalidating to a lot of people. The same racist society and white people with power in the industry determine what is authentic, especially because even in the best case of all, even if unique minority films exist, majority controls the media, which chooses to highlight and nominate 10 more white films and control social influence so that no one sees these minority films at the end of the day. But even if you don't believe all of this, opening cannot win this debate because both teams are divorced from reality. Art is relatively low impact. So if OO says that we can create social change just with art, it's unlikely and speculative at best. They assert that authenticity is an overriding premium in art, when at best, maybe pretentious art industry cares, but the average audience member just wants to watch something entertaining, so their incentives still fail. Let's talk about OG. They assert that there is no minority art at all on OP and rely on artists putting themselves through new trauma just to make content, which is way too extreme. The more powerful and realistic impact is twofold. Firstly, even if you do that, the process is worth of digging deep from your own trauma is traumatic and that's worth regretting. And secondly, it ruins people's lives a lot more. Last response though, on opening, right? Realize that it's very hard to determine what an authentic struggle really is. So even in the best case, if society knows what is authentic, there still results in gatekeeping of some other people's lived experiences. Because when you say something is a struggle, right, you make it seem like it has to be a minority horrible struggle at the end of the day. So every person who's just struggling with their own mental health, their depression, maybe they're in the minority, but they're oppressed by their husband. Maybe they're in the majority and they're white and they're rich, but they're oppressed by their husband, but they still go through their own depression. The problem with OP is that they invalidate everyone else's struggles because there's a race to the top and society just bandwagons on thinking that, oh, you're just whining if your oppression is not as bad as everyone else's minorities, and therefore you invalidate so much more people, the vast majority of people, and that is horrible. Firstly, then, on why this ends up digging up trauma and why it's so bad. Firstly, artists are expected to be a certain way, right? Because of the tortured artist and pain and suffering. But that necessarily means that pain and suffering should be necessary to make good art. And therefore, it warps the perception of what can be seen as entertaining or objectively talented, which lowers the general perception of art as a whole, right? Sure, artists maybe can be recognized, but it has to be from a place of oppression, no matter how many hours you spend on your life's work and your passion about creating something beautiful. But even if you don't care about that, secondly, art cannot be a profession anymore. All of a sudden, it has to be for your soul. And therefore, you shouldn't monetize these things unless it's very authentic, right? There's already a current norm towards saying that, oh, wow, you're monetizing this thing. It's so lowbrow. It's not even authentic. So you shouldn't be paid for those kinds of things. The real reality in this debate, since social change is speculative, is that artists are the most vulnerable people that we can affect in this motion. OO hates racism so much, but makes the same sweeping generalization that artists don't matter if they are white, right? Realize that among artists as a whole, this depression is disproportionately higher, right? Substance abuse is disproportionately higher. And there's an extreme stigma from society that art is not useful and humanities are not useful compared to science and etc., right? So therefore, we need to protect these people and earn ways for them to pursue their passions regardless of their oppression. But thirdly, even if you try to fight against this norm, you are educated in art school and taught to always involve your own personal experiences and dig up this trauma no matter how bad it is, because you think that it's normal for you to constantly hate your life and be traumatized just because that's necessary grind mentality to become an artist, right? But let's take the best case of OP, which OG never does, right? Even if it is authentic, the expectations to make your art marketable still exists, because you still need to sell this to a bunch of white studios that have all the money, right? You still need to make sure that an audience actually sits down and watches your art for the whole thing, right? So for your experiences to be to be cared about, you still have to invalidate them or sensationalize them to an extent, and which traumatizes you even more because you only care at this point at the end of the day, right? There are three impacts to this, right? Firstly, art is no longer fulfilling, right? First level, artists have people constantly invalidating you, and they have to keep digging for their existing trauma. They have to relive and edit their art up so it's not triggering for others. But in that process itself, they have to trigger themselves and they can never really move on. Secondly, they are not seen as validated by the rest of society because you don't think you can heal from your own trauma, because once you move on to more happy art, the rest of society starts thinking that, oh, you're being inauthentic all of a sudden, right? People invalidate you and force you to go back to a darker place. That's why Billie Eilish's happy songs are seen as fake, and she's forced to keep digging into depressing songs until she's completely empty. I'll take opening now.
While you say that the elite will hijack the process of glorification, you don't answer why you won't have the industry change on your side. At least OO creates a demand. So even if you don't go to art school, you have your authenticity to work with and succeed.
I'll get to the counterfactual in a second and therefore beat OG on that as well. But second impact to this, right? Op asserts that artists always have a choice, but remember that just always coercing the choices of artists will probably result in less good art at the end of the day. Third impact, burnout, right? The fact that artists have to keep drawing deeper and deeper. At best, you have one film, which is genuine self-expression, but that artists will probably retire and probably just opt out of the industry and opt out of sharing their stories because they have to be so authentic. But lastly, it's so unsustainable, right? In the best case, if you want to empower minority artists on your side, you can't sustain it because you only have so many experiences of yourself. So you either make art that is boring or you make art that's about others, which you just fake since the experience is not yours, and you end up getting canceled because of that. On any outcomes of op, it's horrible. What is the counterfactual on our side? Firstly, you can portray diverse amount of art and a wide range of experiences. So since it's speculative whether you are really authentic on opposition, at least on government, the artists get to express themselves maximally. But secondly, artists get to have their expression validated, right? They can make their own art on whatever they want, and their life experiences, if they want, they can make it, but they don't have to torture themselves just because of the expectations of others. But lastly, it's a lot more profitable. More artists get to eat, and if every impact in this debate is speculative, at least on our side, you can monetize things easier, and you can feed this very oppressed group of society at the end of the day. Everything we have is higher impact than opening. We must win.
I think the member of government for their speech. Now I invite the member of opposition. Here.
Right. Can you hear me there? Loud and clear. Yeah.
Yep, you are.
Thank you. It's me 1 second. I'll set my timer on and I'll begin with my speech. I would like the POIs to be done strictly on chat, please. Thank you. Okay. All right. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are two main art circuits that we can discuss on this motion. The first one that has been, I think, probably the most discussed until in this part of this debate is about like commercial art and how, for example, mainstream media, how, for example, like the huge movie industrial complex works. And I believe this has a really limited impact on the specific discussions on minority and like talking about like conflictive matters, right? Why is this true? Three main things. Firstly, notice that the market has a really small limit of the things you can produce, even if you can have like diverse stories, right? We agree on opening opposition that you probably can tell diverse stories about like different minorities, but even this is filtered by what the market wants, which is probably something that is moderate for massive audiences, right? As I need to cater to a massive audience, I cannot afford to be really controversial or risky, right? Secondly, some projects are not even green lighted in the first place because they seem to be really personal, or because they are not related to the tendencies that the markets are seeing, right? As markets work with tendencies, they probably have to shut down a lot of art in the first place, right? But thirdly, and most importantly, because I believe that the other kind of art, the art, for example, that is publicly funded, is directly related to people in two ways. Firstly, these are open spaces for people to watch art because they are like presented by the state. But secondly, this is done with the money of people. I'm going to explain to you why this is really important in the debate. So I believe that the place where like the most complex and controversial stories are told, and when the place where minority artists could actually be represented, is the specific public funded sector. I'm going to explain you to why it's much better in our side of the house compared to government's counterfaction, right? Firstly, note that we have a rise of conceptual art and really weird and complex art that is especially pushed by the elitist Western, by the Western elite, like in things like, for example, prizes, scholarships, galleries. Think about the Turner Prize in the UK, which constantly awards the top prize to things that are really, really hard to understand, like, I don't know, lights turning on, like a bed without like a really clear meaning behind it, right? Like just a empty room with like insults painted, right? This is a massive tendency for two main reasons. Firstly, because there has been a massive shift between like realism that was really popular 100 years ago, and now that it's now when surrealist and like really conceptual and how things are prized and rewarded. But secondly, because artists have the incentive to be as complex and mysterious as they could be, because it probably means that they could attain more attention from critics and stuff like that. So the main issue with all of this is that probably this disenfranchises people from getting art in the first place, right? They don't get what the fuck is going on, right? First, they think this is elitist bullshit, right? They believe that this art is only done for the sake of the artist and their elitist friends, and therefore people don't feel connected to this art. Secondly, notice that people tend to stop using public facilities because probably now they are expecting to see something really weird and that is really far from their own stories in art, and therefore they don't afford the opportunity cost to spend a weekend going into a museum on the first place, right? Thirdly, they probably don't establish a dialogue with the story that is being told by the artist, right? Even if people go and watch this, as this is completely away from their perception of reality, and probably it's really hard to understand because it's conceptual art, we already know that. Probably people don't feel connected, and therefore they don't establish a dialogue with these things, right? So why is this terrible? Firstly, on principle, notice that people are basically robbed of their labor to support something that they don't get. This is terrible, right? Because people don't consume in the first place where to put their money in. If the state is taking a lot of money for you, like in Europe, like how Europe works, to support the arts and have like publicly funded art, you probably have some sort of like claim to get and be involved in the artistic process, to know what the fuck they are portraying with your money, and probably to feel connected to this art. Secondly, notice that audience who lack cultural capital will not value the art in and of itself. Art is not good in and of itself. It's good in as much it creates a dialogue between people and people can feel connected. It is a safe space for people to express their own feelings. This means that when art disenfranchises people, it is not fulfilling their purpose. But thirdly, calls to reduce public funding of art increases, right? Because they don't understand what the fuck they're going on. So what of all this means, how this changes is uniquely by this motion. Firstly, notice that probably now there is a massive pressure for artists to include storytelling and this bit of realism into the art. So even if we have this tendency, we have now a counterbalance of realism. This means, firstly, artists are constantly involved in telling the process of their art and their stories, right? So now a product that really didn't make much sense, which was an empty bed by a British artist, is now the story of a woman struggling with depression. This means to create a massive connection with people, and this means probably you feel now that these things are rewarded. Secondly, now the style and the tendency, even if it's about imaginative things and using allegories, are still embedded in reality, which means that people are more likely to actually discuss these things and feel connected in the discussion, right? Because they can relate the artistic product with the things they are perceiving in reality. Therefore, they are more willing to actually spend their money or going into this place in the first place. Thirdly, you cannot be fault of ridiculous actions, for example, for politicians and people who are telling you to shut down these kind of things, because now you probably have like a better set of artists and stories that probably people relate to, right? All of this means that probably the kind of stories that OO wants to talk about, which are really triggering stories, are only capable in our side of the house when probably we have this kind of art presented. Finally, let's talk about why the specific minorities will be severely included, because this is a challenge that both government teams have given to opening opposition. The first reason is that for these are progressive echo chambers, right? Even as we admit that we are talking about elitist white people, notice that people from this artistic world are constantly forced to question their own reality and viewpoint, right? What risk is severely rewarded by artists. This means also to question the current structures and ideologies. This means that that's why empirically most of people from Hollywood and the art world tend to be left-wing or left-leaning, so therefore they're probably going to care more about minorities. Secondly, critics, right? Art critics, the ones who, or curators, are probably, their prestige depends on finding the new tendency, right? Into breaking up the status quo. Because if you as a curator don't do this, you're probably going to be rejected, and therefore you have the incentive to choose riskier products from minorities or exclusively outside of the house by doing this. But lastly, notice that in a lot of cases, probably there is public pressure. We're talking about progressive countries like Europe, when probably things like affirmative action is in order, so probably a lot of minority artists will be publicly funded for all these proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for their speech. Now I invite the government with here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, let me just wait for my janky laptop camera to turn on. There we go. Okay, I'll take PYs in chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. If there's one thing we know about pain, it's that it always demands to be heard. In this speech, I'm going to do 3 things. First, I'm going to directly respond to closing opposition, doing my job. Secondly, I'm going to give to you 5 reasons why my partner's arguments win the round. And then thirdly, I'm going to do some direct response to opening opposition if I have time, but the weighing should be sufficient to make us win. So first of all, direct response. CEO's main point is really on understandability and how this is bad because the state takes money to fund impossible to comprehend art. First response, surely this just gives you reasons for why the state and indeed art galleries on both sides will try to pick art that people can understand, and instead of those random art pieces that CEO mentions that I've never heard before. Secondly, it's not clear that a narrative based on lived experience would make things understandable. Like on both sides, it may be about people that we can see, but on their side, it will be about the lived experience of the artist. And in fact, these artists come from different contexts. These artists talk about people that you'll never meet or you'll never know, which means that actually it's very incomprehensible to you if it's based on someone else's lived experience. But thirdly, is art counterfactual solves for this as well. So even if their argument is true, insofar as our argument also makes art understandable, because there's an incentive to pull from different contexts to make your art message more understandable to people, because there's no priority on your particular lived experience, it means both sides have tools to make things understandable. So at minimum, closing opposition's argument in the round is not enough to take it over us because we meet their same goal. So I guess if CEO wants to weigh really hard, then we can get the 3 points, they can get the 2 points. Okay, let's now weigh my partner's argument, which is really the important thing for my speech anyway. So the first reason and the easiest reason to vote for closing government is because we have the strongest harm for artists, the most vulnerable group of people. The first thing I'm going to do is show why we beat opening government in terms of their harm towards artists. Here, I want to re-articulate precisely what they said. The first source of their harm is that artists expose themselves to trauma in order to create new sources or pools for inspiration for art. So they'll go through depression, they'll make themselves go to difficult life situations. I think both Mikko's responses to this and Bea's response to this sufficiently take it down. What do we say over this that takes over them in terms of charitability and in terms of mechanical rigor? The first thing we do is we provide mechanism that expands the harm. We talk about where glorification applies. It applies from how you are educated as an artist. It applies from what people will buy. It applies to what art directors expect from you and what they will shame you for not doing. This means that this art harm is not just, oh, it's a small thing, therefore you cannot believe opening government's extreme harms, but because it is at every stage of the art life cycle, you feel deeply insecure. You don't feel like you're a real artist if you speak about not real trauma. So we expand that harm massively by one, making it much more likely to unlock opening government's harm in the first place. Secondly, though, we also provide you many more harms to the artists that are larger in gravity. What are these harms? Let me recapitulate the 4 we gave. Number 1, we said there is an intense fear and anxiety that your authentic struggle is invalidated because society tends to be particularly bad at determining an authentic struggle, which means you're always worried if your art will be validated by others, let alone the trauma Olympics where you compare your trauma to another artist and feel like it's not as bad as theirs. This is an intense fear that makes you distance yourself from art and burn out faster. Secondly, we talked about how the process of reviewing and cultivating art is a new form of abuse. That is to say, it makes you feel bad because you're constantly editing that art over and over again, where you have to relive the trauma in the first place. Thirdly, we said it's harder to heal because it discourages artists from moving on because they feel like that art will become inauthentic because of the fact that it no longer reflects who you are now. That's why many artists don't move on. That's why many artists languish and suffer in their sorrows and never change. Fourthly, we also said this made the art world unsustainable as a profession. These harms are much larger in gravity and scale over opening government. One, because they deal with the artists before they make art, so in many cases it discourages them from pursuing their life's passion in the first place. It adds new levels of trauma that don't rely on you somehow getting depression or racism, which you can't really force onto yourself anyway. Number three, it talks about everything else they might like to do, because for them to want to do other things, like, I don't know, pay for their kids' tuition or something like that, they need to have the art job be sustainable. But if it's not possible, because either you'll be seen as a faker or because you have to constantly dig into trauma that's just not there because you've already drawn deeply from the well, you lose. Given that we win this issue, I'm then going to explain why this issue beats government opposition benches other issues. Prima facie, this is the most important issue in the round in terms of artists. Why? Number one, of course, as Riv already says, there are uncertain effects on the rest of society. It's not clear if it helps or harms them. But secondly, is that these artists are the most proximate to the process of producing art. They're the ones that are most subject to the social narratives that stigmatize making certain kinds of art. And most importantly, this is prerequisite to every other impact. For minority artists to join, as opposition says, the art field has to be welcoming for them. It has to be a place where they can make money, and it has to be a place where they can survive. If it is not that type of place, then no matter how inclusive they make consumption be, if there's just no minority artists in the first place, then they can't get any of their benefits. This means that we win the debate by winning artists both over opening government and on opening opposition.
So your argument presumes that lived experience is just trauma. We gave reasons that this healing and recovery is a part of lived experience, why you're more likely to talk about it, and why everyone interpreting your experiences is not going to do so.
That's a problem because you don't understand the argument that my partner gave to you. We said even if it wasn't trauma, the process of reliving everything in your life was incredibly struggling and incredibly difficult. But beyond that, the market incentives made you push towards trauma more and more. And thirdly is that because there's a race to the bottom compared to other artists, it might not be trauma at first, but because the factors of the pressure to be as authentic as possible, it moves towards suffering rather than the mundane experiences that everybody shares. Okay, secondly, let's also win on the minority point. Here, I want to deal specifically with what opening opposition says in response to our POI. Their point is that consumption increases, but our POI was not about consumption. It was about the curation of social narratives. Our whole point in terms of response was that this curation process exists and uses this lived experience and authenticity as a tool to extend racism, not as a tool to fix it. All of the mechanisms they say apply. When they say the subjective space is a way for bias to be introduced, that's precisely how social discussions become skewed against minority artists. It's why so many art forms are basically just for white people, like Midwest rock, which, by the way, both Mikko and I love as a genre, is just basically music for white people. Because the fact that these live experiences, but they're not the same for everyone. So the ones that get prioritized are the ones for white people, the ones that live in the American Midwest, which means a prerequisite for consumption is that elites put it in art galleries, media executives put it on television, and social media people promote it. But the problem is that this never happens because those structures that rely on people to consume them are first curated by the people that drive this narrative. They extend, expand, and exacerbate racism and oppress minorities more. That's why our counterfactual fixes it, and that's why we win this debate.
I think the government went for their speech. Now I invite the opposition with. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Shout out to Joaquin and to Meli. Love you guys. Okay. The demand on our side is for you as an artist and your artwork to be connected at a personal level. That can look like Ice Cube singing When They Will Shoot, and us knowing that that shit is authentic because he fucking lived in the ghetto. That looks like Cancerbero talking about the experience of living in the Latin American barrios. That looks like Ian Tongi singing in America Got Talent, the song from James Blunt, because his father died a few months ago. I want to be very clear on something that Mikko told David, which I think Mikko has the reason here. It's very important. In order for something to be personal, it does not have to be traumatic. And in order for something to be personal, it does not have a burden for you to retell that story in your artwork, which is the prerequisite for CG's extension, right? First part of their extension relies on your personal experience necessarily being traumatic. The second part relies on, even if not being traumatic, it is still a high burden to revisit your life constantly. I really don't think that is the case. Let's tackle particularly why that isn't the case. The first reason why that isn't the case is because our experiences are very complex and are composed from good things, bad things, things that we review and that we remember with gratitude, and things that we don't, which means that essentially there's a large pool of artists, which their art will consist on talking about the relationships. This looks like Taylor Swift. This looks like different artists talking about what they have lived. And that doesn't necessarily has to mean being in constant suffering. But secondly, I just want to say that the process of revisiting your life is far less complex than CG wants you believe. It doesn't mean that you're going to be harassed by your teacher in order to do something that's extremely and deeply personal. The connection can look in different ways. One, it can be your motive to do art. Maybe I'm connected to me as an artist because I decided that art is what I wanted to do because my father was an artist. Maybe I connected to art as I'm Fito Paez, for example, because my dad worked in a music shop, and that's why I was connected to artists like Charlie Garcia. Those things can also connect you to art and can make your art authentic and deep. It does not have to be a high-end burden, which means that their extension, in OG's case, is contingent on something that's not demonstrated. Sure, they'll be right sometimes, but there's no certainty that they'll be right most of the time, which is why they cannot win this round. Now, let's get into the next idea, which is what Mauricio talks about and our extension, and how our extension takes the round very clearly. Our extension is simply that in most cases, the alternative, it is not art, that particularly with this debate matters more because of the three reasons Mauricio explains why the private sector of art is a sector in which the stories that opening opposition wants to tell are often not told because of how high personal are, how risky it is to talk about those personal things, but also because of CG's response of how that industry is mostly controlled by white people. This motion matters more in the public funding sector of people putting a fucking banana on a table and wants us to believe that that is art. We explain right there that the impossibility to access the production of art is far larger on their side, which is why we take that clash, because in their side, there's still a high burden to do something. But I just want to say that it is far harder to find some abstract shit and have the ability to say that that is art on their side than it is to have a personal experience. Because guess what, guys? All of us have some degree of personal experience. We've all lived something that we can tell in some way. So it's far more accessible to tell something that is personal than it is to engage with the modern type of art that is popular on their side, which is extremely relevant because I think it takes it over the main contention that OG wanted to forward in this debate. I'll take opening.
DPM explains minorities become popular due to rise of social movements and increasing education, meaning pressures for governments to fund minorities is symmetric. And our argument and how artists have more incentive to fight for money is far more tangible and intense than CG's emotions for their artists, so we beat them too.
Okay, I think that's incredibly unrealistic, but the response that's more substantive to the POI and to your case as a whole has to do with what Mal explains, which is the following. It is not about if they would want to fund them or not, which I believe we still take that clash over you, but more specifically, it's all about how likely it is that you'll be able to highlight yourself as an artist in both sides. And as I've just explained, the ability to access those art schools that will give you all the intellectual tools in order to produce a very complex, modern or neo-modern piece of art are far less accessible in comparison to just your fucking life story, which you always have. You can always play the violin for the audience. That's far more easier to do. So again, even if not about funding, we still take that against opening government. Okay, now some direct responses to CG, which are also important. I think the first thing CG says needs some fact-checking as well. The idea of you can lie, and there's pressure for lying, because if what validates you is how authentic you are, then you'll just try to pose as authentic. If not, you're not gonna get all the recognition that you could have. No, like, I'll just say that logistically it's very hard to do that, and it's very easy to fact check the authenticity of the story of someone. It takes like one interview of one ex-classmate to say, you know what, this guy sings about guns, but he actually lived in a very good neighborhood. His story is bullshit, it's not authentic, in order to disprove those stories. So oftentimes it is far easier to understand when someone is being authentic and when someone is not being authentic, which is something that happens far more on our side. But now, the particular importance of this has to do with the ability for you to connect with art deeply. And this is the last part of my speech, which is the weighing in two different dimensions, which I think leads to the conclusion that we take the debate also over opening opposition. What Mao explains is that the alternative would be art that is farly more difficult to understand on their side. And that has an impact not only amongst artists, but consumers. All consumers that have also experiences that wouldn't be told on their side of the house are far greater in number. But secondly, they have a right to participate in the process of what art is being created, or at least to be somewhat represented, because oftentimes we're talking about artworks that are being funded with public money. But secondly, and this is the second part, even if not, the particular explanation that Mao gives is just far more specific to a debate that's not symmetric, which I think it is a problem on opening opposition's case, which is why the distinction between commercial art and public funded art was relevant in the round. I think that should be more than enough to take the first closing opposition. Thank you so much for your attention.
I thank the opposition for their speech. This concludes the debate. Thank you all debaters for a wonderful debate. Mostly, I think we can stop the stream. And yes, this is a silent round. I think debaters can leave this breakout room so that we can deliberate.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks for
For the round.
judging.
Thanks, everyone.
For round.